but something in her eyes stopped him. "Please, just make it quick," she said. The rain fell steadily that evening, drumming softly on the roof of John's ambulance as he navigated through the quiet streets. The sky had turned a dull gray, and puddles reflected the flickering streetlights like scattered pieces of broken glass. John had seen many rainy nights before, many accidents, many emergencies. But something about tonight felt different. He had been on duty for almost 10 years, and yet, each time he heard the call, a mix of adrenaline and worry surged through him. The call came in just moments ago. A minor car accident on a narrow street near the old part of town. It didn't sound serious at first. No reports of serious injuries, no mention of children or elderly passengers. But John knew better. Even small accidents could hide deep fear, shock, or pain in ways that weren't immediately obvious. As he drove, he thought of all the people he had met over the years, all the stories he had glimpsed in a single look, a single gesture, a single tear. When he arrived, the scene was calm compared to other accidents he had seen. There were a few onlookers, umbrellas in hand, watching quietly from the sidewalks. One car had skidded off the wet road and was resting awkwardly at an angle, its front bumper lightly dented. The driver's side window was rolled down, and inside sat a young woman, her hands trembling as she gripped the steering wheel. She seemed small and fragile in the large seat, and her eyes caught John's attention immediately. They were wide and alert, yet there was something else in them, a quiet, raw vulnerability that made him slow down instinctively. She looked at him as he approached, her gaze holding a mixture of fear, resignation, and a kind of silent plea. When she spoke, it was barely above a whisper. "Please, just make it quick," she said, her voice trembling ever so slightly. There was a note of exhaustion in her words, as if she had been carrying a heavy burden for a long time, and this accident was simply one more weight on her shoulders. John knelt beside the car door, keeping his voice calm and even. "Okay," he said softly. "I'll be quick. Just let me check you, make sure you're okay." He noticed the way her shoulders tensed and her eyes darted toward the back seat, then back to him. She didn't move, didn't protest, but she also didn't relax. There was a story behind that quiet plea, something deeper than the minor cuts and bruises that might have resulted from the accident. As he started his initial assessment, John tried to make small conversation, hoping to ease the tension. "It's just a small bump," he said, glancing at the car. "You're going to be fine. Did you feel any pain anywhere?" She shook her head slightly, not trusting herself to speak. Her hands were clammy against the steering wheel, and he could see the faint tremor of her fingers. Even though there were no obvious injuries, the fear in her eyes was unmistakable. John had learned early in his career that fear could be as dangerous as physical injury. Shock and panic could make the body respond in unpredictable ways, raising heart rates, causing nausea, and even fainting. But beyond the physical symptoms, there was something intangible in the eyes of someone truly frightened, the way their gaze could silently tell a story of pain, loss, or struggle that words couldn't yet capture. And in this young woman's eyes, John saw a story he wanted to understand, even if she wasn't ready to tell it. He continued gently, asking her to move her arms, check her pulse, and follow simple instructions. Each time she obeyed, but her eyes never left his. There was a tension in her posture, a tightness in her expression that told him she was holding something back, something more than the shock of the accident. He could almost feel the weight of it, like an invisible presence pressing down on the small space between them. John glanced around the scene briefly. The street was slick with rain, the faint smell of wet asphalt mingling with the metallic tang of the car. The few bystanders gave them space, sensing the quiet intensity of the moment. No one interrupted, no one made a sound, and it was as if the world itself had slowed down to let him be there with her, to let her story emerge in its own time. He decided not to rush. Normally, paramedics work quickly, moving from patient to patient, checking for injuries, stabilizing, and moving on. But tonight, John felt that patience was more important than speed. Sometimes, the smallest pause, the quietest moment of attention could make the biggest difference. He kept his tone soft, his movements careful, showing through his actions that he was not just treating a patient. He was acknowledging a human being in distress. "Can you tell me your name?" he asked gently, kneeling beside her. "Emily," she whispered. "Emily," he repeated, nodding. "That's a beautiful name. I'm John. I'm here to help you." She nodded faintly, her eyes darting toward the rain outside as if seeing it for the first time. There was a fragile trust beginning to form, the kind that can only come when someone senses that they are truly seen, not just observed. John continued his gentle examination, checking her neck, her wrists, and her head for any signs of injury. Everything appeared fine, physically. There was no major wound, no blood, no broken bones, but Emily's eyes told him something different. They told him that even without visible injuries, she had been hurt, deeply, in ways that weren't immediately measurable. He decided to ask more carefully. "Emily, are you okay? Not just from the accident, but everything else?" Her gaze faltered for a moment, and she looked away, her hands tightening around the steering wheel. Then she whispered, almost inaudibly, "I don't know." John understood immediately. He had heard that answer countless times in different forms from countless people. "That's okay," he said gently. "You don't have to have the answers right now. Just take a breath. I'm here." For the next few minutes they sat together in quiet, letting the rain outside fill the silence. It was a strange kind of calm amidst the chaos of a rainy evening, a pause in time that allowed Emily to begin letting go of just a little of her fear. The storm outside mirrored the storm inside her, and yet, in that moment, it felt as though they were both weathering it together. John made a mental note of her composure. Despite the tremor in her hands and the quiet plea to just make it quick, there was a strength in her eyes, a hint that she had survived hardships before, and she would survive this moment too. It was subtle, almost invisible, but he recognized it instantly. That small glimmer of resilience was what sometimes kept people alive, even when everything else seemed overwhelming. As the sirens of the ambulance faded in the distance, signaling the arrival of his colleagues for a full checkup, John stayed with Emily, continuing to speak softly, to reassure, to acknowledge. He knew that the real challenge wasn't only treating physical injuries. It was reaching the part of her that was hurting inside, even if only for a few minutes. Emily's eyes, once wide with fear, began to soften. A small nod, a faint exhale, and a tiny, almost imperceptible smile hinted that she felt a little safer, a little less alone. And for John, that was enough for now. Sometimes saving someone wasn't about rushing. It was about being present, being patient, and letting the world pause long enough for them to breathe. As the ambulance team finally approached, John gave Emily a small, reassuring nod. "We'll take good care of you," he said. "Just keep looking at me, and we'll go one step at a time." Emily nodded again, this time with a fragile, quiet trust. And in that moment, John realized something he had always known but never stopped appreciating. No matter how many emergencies he attended, no matter how many accidents he saw, every person carried a story behind their eyes, and sometimes all it took was someone to stop, really see them, and listen, even in silence, for that story to begin to heal. The ambulance's flashing lights painted the wet street with red and blue streaks, bouncing off puddles in the glistening asphalt. John guided Emily slowly toward the vehicle, careful not to rush her. The rain had slowed to a soft drizzle now, but the chill in the air still clung to her like an unwelcome shadow. He could see her shivering slightly, though she tried to hide it by wrapping her arms around herself. Inside the ambulance, the usual sounds were a mix of beeping monitors, soft footsteps, and muffled voices through the headset. But for Emily, it was overwhelming. Everything seemed larger than life. The lights too bright, the smells too strong, and the sense of being exposed too intense. She gripped the edge of the stretcher nervously, her fingers white from holding on so tightly. John noticed her tension immediately. He knelt beside her again, speaking in a low, calm voice. "It's okay, Emily. You're safe now. I'm right here. Just take slow breaths with me." He demonstrated, inhaling slowly through his nose, then exhaling gently through his mouth. After a few moments she followed, her breath shaky at first, then gradually more controlled. As they settled, John started a careful, gentle conversation, keeping it light but purposeful. "You know," he said, "most people think paramedics only deal with broken bones or cuts. But sometimes the hardest things we help with aren't visible. Sometimes it's the fear, the worry, or the things weighing on your heart." Emily looked at him, her eyes still wide but softer now. There was a glimmer of curiosity mixed with relief. She hadn't expected anyone to notice the fear behind her polite words, the weight she tried so hard to hide. I'm okay," she said softly, but her voice had a fragile edge, as if speaking the words made her more aware that she wasn't truly okay. John nodded knowingly. "I understand," he said. "You don't have to explain everything if you're not ready. But if you want, I'm here to listen. No judgment, no rushing." He paused, letting the words settle. The ambulance's hum and the quiet drip of rain on the windows created a calm rhythm, like a heartbeat in the background. For a long moment, Emily stayed quiet, staring at the ceiling of the ambulance. Then, slowly, she began to speak, not about the accident itself, but about the exhaustion she had been carrying for months. She spoke in small, hesitant sentences, sharing pieces of her life she had kept hidden from friends and family. She talked about losing her job unexpectedly, the long nights she spent worrying about rent, and the constant feeling of being invisible in the world around her. John listened intently, nodding occasionally, offering gentle reassurance. He didn't interrupt or try to fix anything. He simply acknowledged her words. "That sounds really hard, Emily," he said quietly. "I can hear how much you've been carrying on your own." Her eyes glistened with unshed tears, and for the first time she allowed herself to relax a little. The walls she had built around herself, the polite smile, the quick words, the wish to just make it quick, were slowly beginning to crumble. She realized that for the first time in a long while, someone was truly paying attention. Someone was truly seeing her. The conversation flowed naturally, moving from her immediate fears to the moments in her past that had shaped her. She spoke of her childhood, of growing up in a small town where dreams felt bigger than reality, and of the constant pressure to appear strong even when she felt fragile inside. She talked about friendships that had faded, relationships that had ended, and the sense of being alone in a world that never seemed to stop. John didn't offer cliches or empty encouragement. He simply listened, repeating back small pieces to show he understood. "You've been carrying a lot by yourself," he said softly. "It's no wonder you feel tired. It makes sense that something like this accident would feel overwhelming, even if it's small in the grand scheme of things." Emily's breathing began to slow even more, her hands loosening their grip on the stretcher. The fear that had seemed so sharp moments ago was now softened by the presence of someone who cared, someone who saw her not just as a patient but as a person. She hadn't realized how much she needed that, just to be acknowledged, just to be heard. John glanced at the monitors and equipment, making sure she was physically fine, but he paid equal attention to her emotional state. He knew that trauma often hides behind a calm exterior, that the most vulnerable people are not always the ones crying or screaming. Sometimes they are the ones who whisper, "Please, just make it quick," and try to bear it all alone. The rain outside had stopped completely now, leaving the streets slick and reflective. The soft light from the ambulance's interior illuminated Emily's face, highlighting the subtle changes in her expression. There was still fear there, but it was mingled with curiosity and cautious hope. John smiled faintly, realizing that sometimes the first step to recovery was simply connection, letting someone know they were not alone. As the ambulance continued toward the hospital, John continued to speak quietly with Emily, asking gentle questions about her day-to-day life, her favorite memories, and small things that brought her joy. She responded in fragments at first, hesitant, but gradually she began to share more freely. She laughed softly at a memory from her childhood, a brief, unexpected smile breaking through the tension. For John, that small moment was a victory, a sign that the walls she had built were starting to shift. Time in the ambulance seemed to stretch differently than in the outside world. Each mile brought them closer to the hospital, but it also gave Emily a space to process, to breathe, to feel safe even in the aftermath of fear. John understood that the journey itself mattered, not just the destination. He didn't rush, didn't urge her to speak faster or feel better faster. He simply accompanied her, step by step, word by word. The conversation also turned practical at times. John explained what would happen at the hospital, a full checkup, some routine tests, and a chance to ensure she hadn't been physically harmed. He spoke about the staff in a reassuring way, emphasizing that everyone there would be professional, kind, and understanding. Emily nodded quietly, the fear slowly giving way to a tentative trust, yet beneath the trust there was still fragility. Emily admitted small fears she hadn't shared with anyone, fears of judgment, fears of being dismissed, fears of being seen as weak. John acknowledged each one without comment, simply listening, validating her feelings. "It's okay to be afraid," he said softly. "It doesn't make you weak. It makes you human." The city lights began to appear in the distance as they neared the hospital. John noticed Emily's posture had changed subtly. She was sitting a little straighter, her hands less tense. The soft rain and the gentle conversation had shifted something inside her. The storm of fear that had seemed so overpowering at the car was now diminished, replaced with a cautious sense of relief. When they arrived, John stayed with her as she was moved from the ambulance to a wheelchair. He ensured she felt secure, holding the blanket around her shoulders, making small talk about the weather and the lights, anything to maintain a calm, normal rhythm. His presence was steady, a reminder that someone was looking out for her, that she didn't have to face the hospital alone. As Emily was wheeled inside, she looked back at John and gave a small, grateful smile. "Thank you," she whispered. It was simple, but it carried a depth that words could hardly capture. In that brief acknowledgement, John felt the weight of what he had just experienced. Not just the physical care, but the emotional care. the quiet support that had made a difference in someone's life. Once inside the hospital, John handed her over to the medical staff, explaining everything he had observed, both physically and emotionally. Pausing that, he stayed long enough to ensure she was comfortable and understood that help was available. Then he stepped back, giving her space, satisfied that he had done more than just a routine job. He had been present, had listened, and had given her a moment of safety in a world that often felt overwhelming. Driving back to the station, John reflected on the evening. It had started as just another call, a minor accident, but it had become much more than that. It had reminded him that the true work of helping people wasn't always visible. Sometimes it was in the small gestures, the quiet patience, the willingness to see someone beyond the surface. It was in noticing the fear in someone's eyes and choosing to stay with them, even for a few moments, without judgment, without rushing. Emily's story was just one of many he had witnessed over the years, but it left an impression on him. He knew that life was full of these small, fragile moments where connection, empathy, and patience could change everything. And he carried that lesson with him as he prepared for the next call, the next person in need, knowing that every story, every life was worth slowing down for, even just for a little while. The hospital room was quiet except for the soft beeping of machines and the occasional shuffle of nurses outside the door. Emily sat on the edge of the hospital bed, her hands resting in her lap, still damp from the rain outside. She watched the sunlight filtering through the blinds, casting long stripes across the floor. Even though she was inside, she still felt the cold lingering from the rainy evening. John had stepped outside to let the medical staff take over, but he remained nearby, just outside the door, ready to respond if needed. He knew Emily wasn't just physically shaken. She carried a storm inside her that wasn't so easy to fix with bandages or medicine. Even sitting alone in the room, Emily felt the weight of everything she had been holding for months. Fear, disappointment, and an exhaustion that went deeper than sleep could fix. A nurse approached her to start the routine checkup. Emily tried to smile politely, but her eyes flickered with hesitation. "I just want it to be over quickly," she whispered. Her voice was barely audible, but it carried the same tired plea she had said earlier in the ambulance. The nurse nodded gently. Understanding her fear without asking questions, she wasn't ready to answer. Emily lay back as the nurse examined her, checking her vitals carefully. Her heartbeat was a little fast, but nothing alarming. Her breathing, though calmer than in the car, still carried a subtle tension. The nurse complimented her on staying calm, and Emily nodded, but the sense of unease remained, like an invisible weight pressing on her chest. After the nurse finished, Emily asked for a few minutes alone. She closed her eyes and let her thoughts wander, thinking back to the evening's events. The rain, the accident, John's calm presence, all of it replayed in her mind like a slow-motion movie. She realized that even though the accident was minor, it had opened a door she hadn't noticed before, a door to her own emotions, to the struggles she had buried under daily routines and polite smiles. Emily thought about the past few months. Losing her job had been the first blow. At first she had tried to stay positive, telling herself it was temporary and that she could find something better, but the longer she searched, the heavier her worry became. Rent, bills, and the pressure to appear composed for friends and family felt like chains she couldn't shake off. Each day she felt smaller, as if life was passing her by while she struggled to keep up. Then came the loneliness. Without the daily structure of work, her days blurred together. She tried to reach out to friends, but their lives seemed full, while hers felt hollow. She avoided phone calls sometimes, pretending she was busy because she didn't want to explain why she felt so lost. The car accident had been minor, but it had forced her to pause, to face not just the immediate fear, but the months of quiet despair she had ignored. John's calm presence in the ambulance had been different from anything she had experienced. He hadn't judged her, hadn't rushed her, and had simply stayed with her while she processed her fear. It was a rare experience, to be truly seen by someone who didn't have an agenda, someone who simply cared. She realized that she had almost never allowed herself to feel seen like that in months, maybe even years. The thought made her eyes water slightly. She wiped them away quickly, embarrassed at her own vulnerability. But there was also a sense of relief. Admitting even silently that she had been struggling felt like a small release. She knew she couldn't undo the past, and she couldn't magically fix everything now, but she could acknowledge that her feelings were real, and that was a start. The door opened quietly, and a doctor stepped in. "Hi, Emily. I'm Dr. Lewis. I just want to check on you, make sure everything's okay," he said warmly. Emily nodded, feeling the tension in her shoulders loosen slightly. Dr. Lewis explained each step of the physical checkup in simple, clear words. She felt safer knowing what was happening, rather than being surprised or overwhelmed by medical procedures. As the doctor examined her, Emily's thoughts returned to John. He had been the first person that night to pause and notice the fear in her eyes. He had spoken to her gently, guided her breathing, and offered small words of comfort. It seemed so simple, but it had made a huge difference. She realized she had been carrying her struggles alone for so long that even a few minutes of genuine care felt extraordinary. After the checkup, the doctor confirmed that she was physically fine. There were no injuries that required further treatment, only some minor soreness from the accident. Emily exhaled deeply, feeling a mix of relief and lingering tension. Her body was safe, but her mind and heart still carried the remnants of the fear and worry that had been building for months. She thought about what to do next. The hospital could only address the physical side of her experience. The emotional weight she carried needed attention too. For the first time in a long while, she considered asking for help, not just from strangers like John or the hospital staff, but from people she knew, maybe even a counselor or someone trained to listen and guide her through these feelings. Emily stayed in the room quietly, reflecting on her life. She realized that she had been trying to just make it quick with everything, her job search, her social life, her own emotions. She had been rushing through life as if speed could fix pain, as if pretending everything was fine could make it so. But the accident and the ambulance ride had forced her to slow down, to notice herself, to confront emotions she had been avoiding. The quiet time gave her clarity. She could not solve everything at once, but she could take the first step. That first step was acknowledging that her fear and exhaustion were real, that it was okay to feel vulnerable, and that she didn't have to face it entirely alone. That thought brought a small, fragile sense of hope. John returned briefly to check on her, his presence calm and reassuring. "How are you feeling, Emily?" he asked softly. She looked up at him and managed a small smile. "Better," she said, the word carrying more weight than she realized. It wasn't complete recovery, but it was a start. The storm inside her hadn't disappeared, but for the first time in months, she felt a small gap of light breaking through the clouds. John nodded, understanding. He didn't press her to explain further. He simply stayed there, silently acknowledging the courage it took for her to begin facing her feelings. Sometimes support wasn't about solving problems. It was about witnessing someone struggle and letting them know they weren't invisible. The afternoon passed slowly. Nurses came in to check vitals and offer water, but Emily spent most of the time thinking quietly, letting her mind sort through the tangled emotions she had avoided for so long. She realized that fear had been a constant companion in her life, always present but rarely addressed. The accident had been a minor physical event, but it had forced her to confront an emotional reality she could no longer ignore. When John prepared to leave, Emily felt a mix of gratitude and sadness. She had never known a stranger could make such a difference in a few brief hours. "Thank you," she whispered again, softly but sincerely. I think I needed this more than I realized." John smiled gently. "You're stronger than you think, Emily. Remember, it's okay to take things one step at a time. You don't have to carry everything alone." As he stepped out, Emily felt a quiet sense of empowerment. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she had taken a first step toward acknowledging her emotions, seeking support, and reclaiming control over her life. She also realized that small acts of kindness, from strangers, from friends, from those who truly listened, could have a profound effect, opening a path toward healing. Emily spent the rest of the day reflecting on what had happened, writing down her thoughts in a small notebook she kept in her bag. She wrote about the accident, the ambulance ride, the calm presence of John, and the strange sense of relief she had felt from being truly seen. She made a promise to herself, to slow down, to acknowledge her emotions, and to reach out when she needed help. That evening, as the hospital lights dimmed and the city settled into quiet, Emily felt a flicker of hope she hadn't felt in a long time. The minor accident had turned into a moment of realization, a turning point that reminded her that vulnerability wasn't weakness, and that even small gestures of care could ignite change. For John, the day was another reminder of why he chose this work. Each call wasn't just about physical injuries, it was about the hidden struggles people carried, the silent battles fought behind every glance, every word, every please, just make it quick. And sometimes the most important work was to pause, observe, and be present in those small, crucial moments. The evening sun cast a warm glow through the hospital window, painting the room in shades of gold and soft amber. Emily sat on the edge of her bed, her small notebook open on her lap. She had spent hours earlier writing down her thoughts, trying to untangle the feelings that had weighed on her for months. Every word she wrote seemed to lift a little of the heaviness from her chest. It was the first time in a long while that she had allowed herself to face her emotions without judgment. John had already left for the day, but the calm and gentle presence he had shared lingered in her mind. She remembered how he had knelt beside her in the ambulance, how his voice had been steady and kind, and how he had listened without rushing or judging. That memory gave her comfort, like a small anchor in the storm she had been navigating alone for so long. A nurse entered to check on her vitals, smiling kindly as she did so. "How are you feeling, Emily?" she asked. Emily paused, thinking carefully before answering. "Better," she said quietly. It was true, but it was also only the beginning. She felt lighter than she had in months, yet she knew that the work of healing herself would take time. After the nurse left, Emily took a deep breath and looked around the room. The hospital walls were stark and plain, but she noticed how the sunlight made everything feel softer, warmer. It reminded her that even in places that seemed cold or clinical, moments of light and hope could exist. For the first time in a long while, she felt she could be present in the moment without being weighed down by past failures or fears of the future. She turned back to her notebook, writing slowly, carefully. She wrote about John, about the ambulance ride, and about the way his calm attention had helped her feel safe, even when the world outside felt chaotic. She wrote about her fear, her exhaustion, and the months of quiet struggle she had endured. As she wrote, a sense of clarity began to emerge, an understanding that acknowledging her emotions was not a sign of weakness, but a step towards strength. Later, the doctor returned to discuss her discharge. "Emily, physically, you're fine," he said with a reassuring smile. "There are no injuries that require treatment. But I can see that emotionally, this has been a big day for you. I want you to know that it's okay to seek help if you need it. Counseling, support groups, anything that helps you process what you're feeling." Emily nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and apprehension. She had always tried to handle things on her own, believing that asking for help was a weakness. But after the evening she had experienced, the accident, the ambulance ride, and John's patient attention, she realized that support was not weakness. It was human. It was necessary. When the doctor left, Emily sat quietly for a long time, thinking about her next steps. She knew she needed to rebuild her life, starting with the small things. She made a list in her notebook. Call her closest friend, reach out to a counselor, go for a short walk each day, and try to reconnect with activities that once brought her joy. Each small step felt like a brick in a foundation, something she could rely on to rebuild herself slowly, carefully. Emily's thoughts turned to the people who mattered to her, those she had been avoiding for months. She realized that loneliness had not only been a result of losing her job, but also of closing herself off. Fear and pride had kept her isolated. But now she felt the desire to reconnect, to allow herself to be supported and to support others in return. It was a new feeling, hesitant but promising, fragile yet full of potential. She spent the rest of the afternoon reflecting on the past, not with judgment, but with understanding. She acknowledged her mistakes, her fears, and her struggles, but she also recognized her resilience. She had survived months of uncertainty and fear. She had survived the accident, and now she had survived this day, taking her first steps toward a new way of living, mindful, deliberate, and gentle with herself. The quiet in the hospital gave her space to breathe, to think, and to imagine a future where she didn't have to hide from her emotions. She pictured herself smiling again, walking outside without fear, reconnecting with friends, and even laughing at small, ordinary moments. The vision was distant but real, a possibility she could work toward, one step at a time. Later that evening, Emily walked slowly down the hospital corridor for a short exercise as recommended by the staff. Each step felt deliberate, each breath conscious. She noticed the little things, the softness of the carpet under her shoes, the sound of her own breathing, the faint hum of the hospital's ventilation system. For the first time in a long while, she was fully aware of her body and mind in the present moment. As she returned to her room, Emily felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. The day had been filled with fear, reflection, and small breakthroughs. She had faced her emotions, allowed herself to feel them, and begun imagining a path forward. It was not a dramatic transformation, but it was meaningful, a small, steady step toward healing. That night, before going to bed, Emily wrote one final entry in her notebook. She wrote about John and the kindness he had shown, about the fear she had felt, and about the small glimmer of hope she now carried. She made a promise to herself to honor her emotions, to seek help when needed, and to approach life with a gentle patience she had never allowed herself before. As she closed her notebook and turned off the light, Emily felt a sense of calm she had not known in months. The storm inside her had not disappeared entirely, but it had shifted. The fear was no longer overwhelming, it was manageable, something she could face step by step, with support and self-compassion. In the quiet of her hospital room, Emily allowed herself to sleep without dread, without the weight of unseen burdens pressing on her chest. She dreamed of sunlight and rain, of small moments of peace and laughter, of a future where she could face her emotions with courage and patience. The accident had been a minor physical event, but it had sparked something profound within her, a recognition of her own resilience and the quiet power of human connection. The next morning, Emily woke with a renewed sense of purpose. She dressed carefully, packed her notebook in a small bag, and prepared to leave the hospital. Each movement was deliberate, each thought conscious. She felt ready, not entirely fearless, but ready to take the next steps in her journey of healing. John had left a note with the staff, reminding her that she was strong and capable and encouraging her to take things slowly. Reading it, Emily felt a wave of gratitude. It was not just a message of kindness. It was a reminder that even small acts of care could change the course of someone's life. She realized that she could carry that lesson with her, sharing it with herself and, someday, with others. As Emily walked out of the hospital doors into the bright morning light, she noticed the world with new eyes. The city was the same as always, with people rushing past, cars honking, and birds chirping in the trees, but it felt different somehow. She felt present, aware, and ready to face her life with patience and care. The fear she had carried was still there, but it was tempered by the knowledge that she could survive it, acknowledge it, and move forward. Emily knew the journey ahead would not be easy. She would face challenges, setbacks, and moments of doubt. But she also knew that she had taken the first meaningful steps toward reclaiming her life. She had learned the value of pausing, of reflecting, of accepting help, and of facing her emotions honestly. And she knew that she would carry the lessons of that rainy evening, of John's quiet, patient presence, into every step she took from now on. Walking through the hospital parking lot, Emily felt a quiet determination settling in her chest. She would rebuild her life gradually, one small step at a time. She would reach out to friends, seek support, and honor her feelings instead of suppressing them. She would not rush herself, and she would not judge herself for the emotions she had carried for so long. The sun climbed higher in the sky, warming her face as she took a deep breath and stepped into the world. She felt lighter, stronger, and more aware of her own capacity to heal. The accident had been a minor event, but the lessons she had learned from it were profound. She had discovered the quiet strength that comes from acknowledging fear, the power of connection, and the courage it takes to face oneself honestly. Emily walked away from the hospital that morning with a small smile on her face and a sense of hope in her heart. She was not fully healed, nor would she be in an instant, but she had begun the most important part of the journey, facing her emotions, embracing vulnerability, and stepping into a life guided by awareness, patience, and self-compassion.